The bull roared for help, and only the horse heard him. The ending is unbelievable. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching this video from. The sound that split the dawn air over Warwick Station in Queensland's Darling Downs wasn't the usual bellow of a bull establishing dominance. This was different, raw, desperate. A roar that spoke of pain and terror, but at 5:30 on that February morning, with the temperature already climbing toward what would be a 42-degree scorcher, not a single human heard it. The only one who heard was Ghost, a 15-year-old grey Arabian mare who'd spent her entire life on the Henderson property. She lifted her elegant head from grazing, ears swiveling toward the sound that came from the far western paddock, nearly 2 kilometers away across rough bushland. Atlas, the 3-year-old Brahman bull worth $15,000 and the pride of Jack Henderson's breeding program, was in trouble. Serious trouble. He'd gone out to the remote paddock 3 days earlier with a mob of cows for breeding, but sometime during the night he'd tried to reach through a section of old fence to get at sweeter grass on the other side. The rusted wire, brittle with age, had snapped and coiled around his massive neck like a noose. The more Atlas struggled, the tighter the wire cut into his hide. Blood matted his white-grey coat. The wire had dug so deep it was pressing against his windpipe. He couldn't eat, could barely drink from the small dam nearby. And as the hours passed, his strength was failing. He roared again, a sound that would have travelled kilometres across the flat country if anyone had been close enough to hear. But the homestead was too far away. Jack Henderson was in town sorting out parts for the header. His son Matt was working on machinery in the shed with his headphones in, listening to Triple M. Nobody heard, except Ghost. The mare had an unusual history. She'd been born on this property, sired by Jack's first Arabian stallion Thunder, who died 7 years back. But Ghost had never been broken properly for riding. She was too spirited, too independent. Jack had tried when she was 4, but she'd thrown every rider who attempted to mount her. Eventually, he'd given up and let her live out her days as a paddock ornament, a reminder of Thunder's bloodline. But Ghost was intelligent, observant. She'd watched the working horses being ridden across the property for years. She'd seen cattle being mustered, seen bulls being moved, seen the patterns of farm life. And she'd developed an unusual awareness of the other animals on the station. Now, hearing Atlas's distress, something triggered in her. She cantered to her paddock gate, a simple chain link that Jack usually kept fastened. But this morning, Matt had been in a hurry feeding the horses and hadn't secured it properly. The chain hung loose. Ghost pushed her nose against the gate. It swung open. She trotted out, then broke into a canter, heading west across the drought-hardened ground. Her hooves kicked up red dust as she navigated through the scattered ironbark and brigalow scrub. She'd lived here her whole life. She knew every gully, every creek crossing, every fence line. Atlas bellowed again, weaker this time. The wire was cutting off more of his air supply. His legs were starting to buckle. At 1,200 kilograms, if he went down completely, he might never get back up. Bulls could die surprisingly quickly once they were cast, lying on their sides unable to rise. Their own weight compressed their lungs and organs. Ghost covered the 2 kilometers in less than 12 minutes, slowing only to navigate the rougher terrain near Mitchell's Creek. When she emerged from a stand of eucalyptus trees, she saw Atlas in the middle of the paddock. The bull's head was lowered, his neck extended unnaturally from the tension of the wire. He was swaying on his feet. 20 meters away, the small mob of cows watched nervously, unsure what to do. Ghost approached slowly, snorting softly. Atlas's eyes rolled toward her, showing white at the edges. He was terrified, in agony, and seeing a horse approach only increased his panic. He tried to bellow again, but only managed a strangled wheeze. The mare stopped 5 meters away. She could see the wire now, glinting in the early morning sun, where it wasn't matted with blood. She could see how it had twisted around his neck, how every movement made it worse. For a long moment, the two animals simply looked at each other. Then Ghost did something extraordinary. She walked in a wide circle around Atlas, examining the fence line, the wire, the bull's predicament from every angle. She'd seen Jack and Matt work with tangled cattle before. She'd watched from her paddock as they carefully approached, used tools to cut wire, worked slowly to avoid spooking the animal. Ghost couldn't use tools. But she had something else, an intelligence that had been underestimated her entire life. The wire ran from Atlas's neck back to a fence post about 7 meters away. It was taut, like a leash holding him in place. Every time he moved forward, it tightened. If he went backward, he might strangle himself completely. Ghost walked to the fence post. She examined where the wire was tangled around the old timber. Then she did something that would have seemed impossible if anyone had witnessed it. She grabbed the wire in her teeth, just above where it wrapped around the post. The wire was sharp, cutting into her gums. She tasted blood, but she pulled backward, using her entire body weight. The wire creaked. The old post groaned. Atlas, feeling the change in tension, instinctively pulled forward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a crack that echoed across the paddock, the rotted post snapped at ground level. The sudden release sent Atlas stumbling forward. He nearly went down, catching himself at the last second. The wire was still around his neck, but now it was dragging behind him, no longer pulling him back toward the fence. Ghost dropped the wire from her mouth, blood dripping from her lacerated gums. She watched as Atlas regained his footing, shaking his massive head, trying to understand what had just happened, but they weren't safe yet. The wire was still wrapped around his neck, still cutting into his hide, and Atlas, in his panicked state, might make it worse if he thrashed around. The mare approached again, this time coming closer. She made a low, nickering sound, the same sound she'd heard Jack's working horses make when calming nervous cattle. Atlas's ears flicked toward her. Despite his pain and fear, something in that sound reached him. Ghost came alongside him, matching his height, even though he was much more massive. She reached out with her nose and gently touched his shoulder. The contact was brief but deliberate. Then she started walking, slowly, toward the small dam at the far end of the paddock. Atlas, driven by desperate thirst and somehow trusting this horse who'd broken him free, followed. His gait was unsteady, the dragging wire catching occasionally on the rough ground, but he kept moving. At the dam, Ghost stopped. She lowered her head to drink, demonstrating what Atlas needed to do. The bull approached the water's edge, but when he tried to lower his head, the wire cut so deeply into his neck that he bellowed in pain and jerked back. Ghost watched this. She could see the problem. The wire needed to come off, but how? Back at the homestead, Matt Henderson finally pulled off his headphones and stepped out of the shed. It was just after 6, and he needed to check the water troughs in the horse paddock before the heat really set in. When he reached Ghost's paddock and saw the open gate, his stomach dropped. "Bloody hell," he muttered. "Dad's gonna kill me." Ghost was valuable, not just financially, but sentimentally. She was the last direct descendant of Thunder. If she got out onto the main road or got tangled in a fence somewhere. Matt ran back to the shed and jumped on the quad bike. He grabbed the radio and called his father. "Dad, Ghost's out. Gate was open. I'm going to look for her now." Jack's voice crackled back through the radio, tight with controlled anger. "How the hell did that happen? I must have not closed it properly this morning." "Right. Well, find her. I'm heading back now. Check the western paddocks first. She usually doesn't go far, but Ghost had gone far." She was still at the dam with Atlas, still trying to figure out how to help him. The bull had managed to drink some water despite the pain, but he was growing weaker. The morning sun was getting higher, the temperature climbing rapidly. Matt covered the near paddocks first, calling out, expecting to see the grey mare grazing somewhere close, but there was no sign of her. He widened his search, heading west toward the more remote areas. That's when he heard it. A sound that made him stop the quad bike and kill the engine. A bellowing but wrong somehow, strained. He'd grown up around cattle. He knew what distressed animals sounded like. He restarted the bike and followed the sound. When he crested the rise near Mitchell's Creek and looked down into the western paddock, he saw something he'd remember for the rest of his life. Ghost was standing next to Atlas. The bull was down on his knees now, unable to stand anymore. The wire around his neck was clearly visible even from a distance, dark with blood. But it was what Ghost was doing that made Matt's breath catch. The mare was using her teeth to carefully, methodically pull at the wire where it had loosened slightly around Atlas's neck. She'd grab a section, pull gently, release, then try another angle. Matt grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Dad, you need to get to the western paddock now. Bring wire cutters, bring the vet kit, and bring the ute. Atlas is down and tangled in wire, and Ghost is trying to help him." "What?" Jack's voice came back confused. "What do you mean Ghost is trying to help him?" "Just get here. You won't believe it unless you see it." Matt killed the quad bike's engine again and approached on foot, slowly. He didn't want to spook either animal. Ghost's ears flicked toward him, but she didn't stop what she was doing. She had managed to loosen one loop of wire around Atlas's neck. The bull's breathing was slightly easier now, though he was clearly exhausted and traumatized. "Easy, girl," Matt said softly. "I'm here to help. Just let me get close, yeah?" Ghost stepped back, as if understanding that human hands with tools could do what her teeth couldn't. Matt knelt beside Atlas, quickly assessing the situation. The wire had cut deep grooves into the bull's neck. Without proper cutting tools, Matt couldn't safely remove it. One wrong move and he could make it worse. Atlas looked at him with eyes that were glazed with pain and shock. 1,200 kilograms of prime-breeding bull, worth more than Matt's ute, reduced to this helpless state. The bull tried to lift his head but couldn't. "Hang on, mate," Matt whispered. "Help's coming." Ghost stood 3 meters away, watching. Blood still dripped from her mouth where the wire had cut her gums. Her grey coat was dark with sweat despite the early hour. She'd run hard, worked hard, and refused to give up. 15 minutes later, 15 minutes that felt like hours, Jack's ute came roaring across the paddock, followed by a second vehicle. Jack jumped out, tools in hand, and behind him came Dave Mitchell, their neighbor who was also the local large animal vet. "Bloody hell," Jack breathed when he saw Atlas. Then his eyes went to Ghost. "And the mare. Matt said she was helping him. She broke the fence post to free him, Dad. I saw her trying to pull the wire off with her teeth. She led him to water. I've never seen anything like it." Dave was already kneeling beside Atlas, his experienced hands checking the bull's condition. "He's in shock, dehydrated, losing blood. We need to get this wire off now and get fluids into him. Jack, hold his head steady. Matt, you're going to need to hold this section of wire taut while I cut." They worked quickly but carefully. Dave used specialized wire cutters designed for exactly this type of emergency. Each cut was deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid causing more damage. Atlas groaned with each manipulation, but he was too weak to struggle much. Ghost watched from nearby, her body tense, as if ready to intervene if needed. But she seemed to understand these humans were helping. Finally, after 20 minutes of painstaking work, the last piece of wire came free. Dave immediately began cleaning the wounds while Jack set up an IV line to deliver fluids and antibiotics directly into the bull's bloodstream. "Is he going to make it?" Matt asked, his voice tight. "Touch and go," Dave replied honestly. "The wounds are deep. There might be nerve damage. He's lost a lot of blood and he's badly dehydrated, but if we'd found him an hour later, he'd be dead. No question." Jack stood up, wiping sweat from his face, and turned to look at Ghost properly for the first time. The mare stood quietly, her head slightly lowered, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "She came and got him," Matt said again. "She heard him calling and she came, then she led me here." Jack walked slowly toward Ghost. The mare had never let him get close without a halter or yards between them. She was the wild one, the unbreakable one. But now she stood still as he approached. He reached out carefully and placed his hand on her neck. Ghost flinched slightly but didn't move away. Jack could see the cuts on her gums where the wire had sliced into her mouth. Could see the sweat and dust coating her normally pristine grey coat. "You saved him," Jack said quietly. "You bloody saved him, girl." Over the next 3 hours, they worked to stabilize Atlas. Dave cleaned and sutured the worst of the wounds. The bull received 4 liters of IV fluids, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and pain medication. Slowly, gradually, his condition improved. His eyes cleared slightly, his breathing steadied. By midday, with the help of the ute and some clever rigging, they managed to get Atlas onto his feet. He swayed, nearly went down again, but Jack and Matt supported him on either side while Dave monitored. "We need to get him back to the yards where I can watch him properly," Dave said. "But he can't walk 2 kilometers in this state." "We'll have to truck him," Jack said. "I'll go get the cattle trailer." But as Jack turned toward his ute, something stopped him. Ghost had walked over to Atlas and positioned herself alongside the bull. She stood perfectly still, her shoulder pressed against his. "What's she doing?" Matt asked. They watched in silence as Ghost began to walk, slowly, one careful step at a time, and Atlas, leaning heavily against the mare, walked with her. The 3 men stood frozen. A 1,200-kilogram bull, barely able to stand, was using a horse as a living crutch. And Ghost, who'd never been ridden, never been truly handled, never shown anything but wildness, was deliberately, patiently supporting his weight. "Get the utes," Dave said quietly. "Follow them. If he goes down, we'll need to act fast. But let them try." What followed was the slowest 2-kilometer journey any of them had witnessed. Ghost set the pace, maybe 20 meters every 5 minutes. Whenever Atlas faltered, she stopped. She'd wait, sometimes nuzzling his neck gently, until he was ready to continue. When the bull needed to rest completely, she positioned her body to provide shade from the merciless sun. Jack and Matt followed in the utes, crawling along in first gear. Dave walked beside them, monitoring Atlas constantly. The mob of cows that had been in the paddock followed at a distance, as if bearing witness. It took 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours under a sun that peaked at 44 degrees. 3.5 hours of one step at a time. But finally, incredibly, they reached the home yards. Atlas collapsed the moment they got him into the holding pen, but he was home. Dave immediately set up another IV line and continued treatment. The bull's condition was stable, though he'd need weeks of recovery. Ghost stood at the fence line, watching until she was satisfied Atlas was being cared for. Then she walked to her own paddock, the gate still open from that morning, and went straight to the water trough. She drank deeply, then moved to the shade of the old peppercorn tree where she always rested. Jack followed her. He brought a bucket of feed with electrolyte supplements mixed in. Ghost eyed him warily, but accepted the offering. While she ate, Jack gently cleaned the cuts on her mouth with antiseptic, applying veterinary ointment to help them heal. "I was wrong about you," he said softly. "All these years I thought you were just too wild to be useful. Turns out you're the smartest animal on this whole bloody property." That evening, after Dave had gone home with assurances he'd be back to check on Atlas in the morning, Jack sat on his veranda with a cold beer and called his daughter Sarah in Sydney. "You won't believe what happened today," he began. He told her everything: Ghost escaping, finding Atlas, the rescue. The 3-hour walk back. As he spoke, he could hear Sarah's disbelief, then wonder, then the catch in her voice that said she was crying. "Dad, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." "Yeah," Jack agreed. 43 years I've been working cattle, and I've never seen anything like it. Animals looking after each other, sure. But this was different. She made decisions. She problem-solved. She showed compassion to a completely different species. Over the following weeks, Atlas made a full recovery. The wounds healed, though he carried the scars. His value might have been diminished slightly by those marks, but Jack declared he'd never sell him anyway. A bull that survives what he did, that's breeding stock worth keeping. But the real change was in Ghost. Jack worked with her every day, slowly, patiently, and the mare, who'd thrown every rider, who'd refused every attempt to train her, began to respond, not because she was broken, but because she chose to trust. 6 months after the rescue, Jack stood in the yards with Matt watching as Sarah, who'd driven up from Sydney for the weekend, sat on Ghost's back for the first time. The mare stood calmly, accepting the weight, accepting the rider. "She's allowing it," Matt observed. "That's the difference. She's not broken. She's willing." Sarah rode Ghost around the yard at a walk. The mare's movements were smooth, confident. When they stopped, Sarah dismounted and hugged Ghost's neck, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for showing us what animals are really capable of." That evening, all three of them stood at the fence watching Ghost and Atlas in adjacent paddocks. The bull, now fully recovered, grazed peacefully. Ghost stood near the shared fence line, and Atlas often came to stand beside her, on his side of the rails. They'd formed a bond that day, bull and horse, two species that shouldn't have connected the way they did, but in a moment of crisis, when a voice cried out for help and only one heard, something extraordinary happened. "You know what the amazing thing is?" Jack said. "We think we're the intelligent ones. We think animals are just simple. But Ghost showed more intelligence, more problem-solving, more compassion in one morning than most people show in a lifetime. The story spread through the district. Mates would drop by asking if it was true. Dave the vet told everyone at the pub. Within a month, a reporter from the local paper came out to write about it. The story ran with the headline, "Horse Saves Bull in Extraordinary Rescue." But for Jack, Matt and Sarah, it was more than just a remarkable rescue. It was a lesson about underestimating those who seem untamable, about listening for calls for help even when they come from unexpected places, about the depth of intelligence and emotion that exists in creatures we too often see as lesser than ourselves. And every evening, as the sun set over Warwick Station, Ghost and Atlas would stand together at their shared fence line. The mare who'd heard a desperate roar, the bull who'd been saved by someone who had no reason to help except that it was the right thing to do. Sometimes, the most unbelievable endings are the ones that actually happen.